Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to our 2015 Worlds of Flavor International Conference and Festival. My name is Drescher. I'm Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and Industry Leadership for the Culinary Institute of America. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this 3 days of, I think, an amazing journey of flavor, culture, and innovation. Did you all enjoy that little taste of Asia down in the restaurant in the patio? Wasn't that wonderful? Yeah. We always love the taiko drummers here. Gets us going. As the Worlds of Flavor veterans in the audience know, how many of you have been to a previous Worlds of Flavor conference? Okay, good for you. We're the CIA. We take notes. We have files on everybody. How many of you are coming for the first time? Okay, great. Well, welcome to those veterans that are returning and those of you that are coming for the first time. For those of you that have been with us before, you know we usually do this in the fall, in November. So we're all getting used to running Worlds of Flavor in the spring with the switch of dates, but certainly the spring is a glorious time to be here in the Napa Valley, and we hope that you'll all get a little chance to get out and see what's going on in the vineyards before you have to head back to your respective locations. We launched this conference series 18 years ago with a vision to bring more attention to the rich diversity of world food cultures that are transforming our menus in our industry. From Asia and Latin America to Europe and the Mediterranean, collectively we've explored through Worlds of Flavor the gold standards of global flavors and techniques and discovered how these century-old traditions are both reimagined by our most talented contemporary chefs, both here and abroad. Our theme this year, Asia and the Theater of World Menus, will engage us in a similar landscape of menu innovation, but through a somewhat different lens, one that spans taste and design, ingredients and the aesthetics of dining, culinary insight, and the art of performance. Asian flavors continue to be a juggernaut in the American food and restaurant sector, as chefs and operators hungrily peel back the onion, as it were, on Asian food and culture and discover the incredible depth and nuance of story, history, and flavor. Whether the theater of Asian food experience plays out in the streets of Hanoi or the ramen shops of Tokyo, the home kitchens of India, or across the breadth of Asia's finest restaurants, the invitation to us is the same. Join us, come with an appetite for adventure and eyes wide open. Let's watch. Bringing this all to life over the next 3 days here in the Napa Valley is an incredible roster of 75 chefs and experts representing or interpreting the cuisines and cultures of 8 countries: China, India, Indonesia, Japan, Thailand, Korea, Singapore, and Vietnam. Many of our presenters have traveled great distances to be with us today, from points east and west and from across the United States. Let's give a warm round of applause to our distinguished presenters that are joining us for the next 3 days. I can't possibly preview all the wonderful presentations and tastings that will soon come our way, but I did want to highlight a very special session that will conclude our conference on Friday, and that is a grand finale of Pastry Imaginations with a whiskey and dessert bar fueled by the incomparable pastry talents of Will Goldfarb, joining us from the island of Bali, and Janice Wong, who is here with us from Singapore, so you surely won't want to miss that. Just a word about our award-winning Worlds of Flavor Conference app. If you haven't downloaded it yet, we certainly encourage you to do that. It's an incredible resource for planning your time at the conference, allowing you to easily reference presentation slides, modify your breakout sessions, look up presenter and sponsor profiles, and so much more. You can download the app there. We have the QR codes posted around the building, so be sure and take advantage of that. I also want to now highlight the role of our conference underwriters. We are grateful to all of our sponsors who, through their support, have been instrumental in making this conference possible. You will be meeting many of them through the conference, and I hope you will take the time to talk to each of them, get to know them, give them a sense of appreciation for their support of this vital industry educational gathering that's been running now for 18 years. I'm going to introduce a few of our lead sponsors, but I encourage you to spend time looking, and we'll have some of the sponsors on the screen throughout and in your program book, but let's have a round of applause for all of our sponsors. So at this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our lead sponsors for the conference. And having traveled from Tokyo to be with us just for this conference, it's a great pleasure to introduce our Grand Platinum sponsor, Suntory Holdings Limited. And please welcome to the podium and thank Ninimi-san, who is the president and member of the board, representative director of Suntory Holdings Limited from Tokyo.
My name is Takeshi Ninami, President and the CEO of Suntory Holdings Limited. Thank you, Greg and Cathy, for this wonderful opportunity. We are proud and honored to be a grand presenting sponsor of Worlds of Flavor at the Culinary Institute of America, Greystone. And also, I'd like to express a special thanks to Mr. Chikaraishi for leading us to this great institution. Suntory is a unique CPG player, strong in spirits. You may know Yamazaki, which won the first prize in the world, and the Hibiki and Hakushu. We also have beverage, wine, beer, and health and wellness units. Beam became our family member almost a year ago, and now it's called Beam Suntory. We are now number 3 world player in the spirits business. We have grown in Japan for almost 115 years with the Japanese food culture. We Suntory have a strong aspiration to penetrate of Japanese food culture in the world. To this aim, we want to explore partnership with the CIA, including sending more people from Suntory. I may be here as one of the students in the future. I want to learn much more. I believe we have started well to do so from this event. From today on, we will keep close contact with the CIA for further partnership. Again, thank you very much.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce, representing Chobani, Stephen Dean, Vice President of Food Service. Stephen? And representing CJ, appropriately enough, with the emphasis here on Korea, Sang-ma, Director of Sales. Sang-ma? And representing one of our longest running partnerships with Kikkoman Sales USA, Debbie Carpenter, Senior Manager, National Food Service Sales and Marketing, Debbie Carpenter. And before I give this plaque to Debbie, I have to tell everybody, we have a lot of loyal sponsors in this room, but Debbie has all 18 of these plaques, so that's a challenge to everybody else here. And finally, representing Unilever Food Solutions, Steve Joliba, Corporate Executive Chef. I also want to mention, some of you may have sat on a luggage tag that we'll tell you more about tomorrow. Don't throw that away. That's your key to some fabulous videos that were made possible because of our partnership with Unilever Food Solutions. So we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Now let's get started with our first general session, From Tradition to Innovation, the Impact of Asia on American Dining. And to introduce our first speaker, it's my pleasure to invite Anne McBride to the podium. Anne is our Director of Culinary Programs and Editorial for the Strategic Initiatives Group and has led the program planning for this year's Worlds of Flavor Conference together with Director of Special Projects Cathy Jörin, who will be seen on the podium as well shortly. Please welcome Anne McBride.
Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you all here at Greystone for this wonderful conference. And the first call I made pretty much when Cathy and I decided to start planning the program, and we had the word theater in the title of the conference, was to Josh Abrams, who will introduce this next session, our keynote presentation. Josh is a principal lecturer in the Department of Drama, Theater, and Performance at the University of Roehampton in London, and he's also the co-director of Roehampton's Interdisciplinary Food Studies Research Group. What that means is that he looks a lot at theater and dining together, and he's actually working on a book about the topic, focusing on the senses and the questions of theatricality around restaurants. So as you can see, and as you will hear from him later with a little more length, he's definitely the right person to get us started and introduce our keynote speaker. Without further ado, Josh Abrams.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted to introduce Ken Albala, who is Professor of History at the University of the Pacific and founder and director of the brand new, very exciting Food Studies Master's Program based right here in Central San Francisco, starting up next year and currently looking for applicants, open for applicants. So I think that's a really exciting program and really shows a lot of the leadership that Ken is developing in the field of food studies. In addition to that, he's authored or edited 23 books on food, including such things as Eating Right in the Renaissance, The Banquet, Beans, book on pancakes, The Business of Food, Human Cuisine, Food and Faith, editor of A Cultural History of Food, and he's editor of the brand new 4-volume Food Cultures of the World encyclopedia, among many, many other titles that he has published and produced. Once you enjoy his great talk today, I would encourage you all to get the DVD set from Great Courses of his Food, A Cultural Culinary History, available widely. And he is also currently working, many of you probably tried a fusion noodle soup, a dish of his. He's currently working on a book around noodle soups throughout the world. So that's going to be published hopefully next year. Ken is based locally in Stockton, and today he is speaking on the impact of Asia on American food, particularly focusing on the impact of Asia, I believe. So without further ado, Ken.
Thank you so much, Josh, and everyone for coming. You know, we know that Asian food has become a cornerstone in the American dining scene, especially in the past several decades. And the popularity and influence of Asian ingredients and techniques, modes of service, has profoundly impacted Western cooking, and I think in successive waves. This is nothing really new. Think of the way Nouvelle cuisine adopted the spare, asymmetrical, or aesthetic of Japan, what's called wabi-sabi, or the focus on the finest fresh ingredients, especially vegetables. Think of how more recently fusion cooking has borrowed flavor combinations from a succession of Asian cuisines, Vietnamese, Korean, Filipino, so that Americans are becoming as familiar with kimchi and banh mi sandwiches as they are with pizza and burritos. Nor need we be reminded that every inventive fusion of flavors, there are recurrent waves of chefs that claim greater authenticity, fidelity to ingredients as they would be found in Asia, and techniques that are uncorrupted by Western kitchen conveniences. So the process of discovering either more authentic or even more obscure Asian cooking is never ending in history. One season it may be Tibetan momos, the next a new Hakka recipe, maybe a Uyghur lagman noodles. It always happens. Regardless of the origin, the West has had a long and really abiding fascination with Asian cooking. It's nothing new. So I'd like to answer this question, why and how these flavors have appealed to Western palates, beyond the fact that obviously Asian people have come to the US, opened restaurants, and eventually people patronize them. And beyond the fact that Asian Americans wrote cookbooks, slowly introduced Asian recipes to mainstream America. The recipes were adapted at first, of course, to suit mainstream taste, and one might argue that these cuisines evolved to a point where they ceased to resemble the cuisines back in Asia. Or they became simplistic caricatures of the original. You know, we all know hybrid inventions like chop suey or General Tso's chicken, dishes that some people would consider bastardizations, but I think more rightly they should be considered evolved recipes, adapting to a new culinary milieu really as a way to survive. And then naturally later generations sought out greater authenticity, but this still, I think, begs a much larger question. How did Western fascination with Asian cuisine arise? Where does it begin? And I'd like to take a very, very long view and then come back to the United States to better understand this phenomenon. Many people have the perception that this was a gradual and not always smooth process, that Asian cooking was originally considered suspect or maybe even dangerous. And we need not be reminded that the first waves of immigrants from Asia indeed faced intense discrimination, especially here in California, when they were brought in as laborers in the gold rush era, and later in 1882, barred entirely through the Chinese Exclusion Act. And there's no denying that relations for Asian immigrants were extraordinarily turbulent. But the same cannot be said for Asian cuisine, oddly enough. For example, Norman Assing opened a Canton restaurant on Jackson Street in 1849, and a year later there was opened the Macau and Wusong restaurant, catering to a much, much broader audience. And the proliferation of restaurants owned and operated by Chinese within the 1850s is really astounding, the vast majority, in fact. As is the fact that they were importing bamboo shoots, bean sprouts, dried oysters, mushrooms, prepared sauces, noodles directly from China to serve in their restaurants. So Chinatown, then as today, has become an object of fascination, particularly the exotic foodstuffs, things like dried fish, water chestnuts, lapchung sausages you see hanging, bitter melons, and people ate in Chinese restaurants precisely to get this frisson of the alluringly exotic and maybe even slightly dangerous. Well, I would like to argue that this has always been the attitude of Western gastronomy toward the East. Not as we might imagine in the past century and a half through direct contact of cultures in the US, but really for several millennia. That is, the allure of Western flavors, of Asian flavors, adopting and adapting them has been a nearly permanent fixture in Western cuisine, and one that we lose sight of as these two cuisines drifted apart, and that's really just in the past 200 years or so. So let me start at the beginning to give you the really, really long story. The appeal of Asia in Western cuisine dates precisely to the earliest and direct sustained contact, and this is following the military conquests of Alexander the Great in Persia all the way to the Indus River in what's today India. Alexander's fascination with Asian culture and even with its food prompted a conscious importation of Asian luxury goods into the West. And we're all familiar, of course, with silk that eventually traveled along the Silk Roads. But I think just as important are fruits like the apricot, which was, the word is Armeniacon. They thought it came from Armenia. The peach, which was called persicon, thought to come from Persia, and citrus fruits as well. So Alexander also found not only spices native to South Asia, like pepper and cinnamon, but later other spices, medicinal drugs, dyestuffs, incense, and things from the further east started to be imported into the West. And I like to call this period the Alexandrian exchange, because food actually went in both directions. By the time Rome had engulfed the Greek-speaking world, it was connected by circuitous trade routes all the way to Han Dynasty China. In ancient Rome, as a measure of wealth, one might serve a dish liberally seasoned, not only with black pepper, but ginger, vinegar, honey, a splash of fish sauce. I know that sounds surprising to you, but the Romans loved what they called garum, which was very much like a nukmam or nampla. China and Rome were not only linked in trade, but in taste preferences. In other words, I would be willing to bet that a modern American tasting a recipe from the cookbook attributed to Apicius, this is the 3rd, 4th century AD, might very well take it for an Asian dish. Let me show you. So imagine this combination of flavors in your mind. It's called a minutal of apricots. It includes oil, fish sauce, wine, shallots, cilantro, cubed pork shoulder, and this is all cooked with pepper, cumin, mint, dill, honey, more fish sauce, and a sweet raisin wine, vinegar, and then apricots. So that's really a East-West fusion dish, no other way to describe it. Again, and these combinations are not only common, but they are the basis of Western cuisine. They're the very roots. That's the oldest complete cookbook in the West. These extensive trade networks did not survive the fall of Rome, though, and neither did its cuisine, resplendent with pepper and garum. So for about 600 years, there's this enormous lacuna, not only in the culinary record, but also in the availability of Asian ingredients. This began to change after about the year 1000, when European economy began to grow again, and along with it, cities and the demand for exotic goods, especially those from the East. The trade in the South China Sea had itself expanded, with spices coming from a little bit further. Things like cloves and nutmeg came from what's now Indonesia, Ternate, Tidore, Banda, or the Moluccas. And a broader range of spices that included cassia buds, which would have come from Vietnam, galangal root, cubebs. And these spices made their way either overland or by boat around the Indian Ocean, up through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, overland to the Mediterranean, to either Alexandria or Beirut. They were picked up there by the Venetians, who, of course, carried them to the rest of Europe. And naturally, by the time they reached, say, London, these things were astronomically expensive. They were remarkable markers of social class. If you could sprinkle pepper liberally all over your dish, you'd be showing how wealthy you are. Although European cuisine was more directly influenced by cooking of Baghdad in the 10th and 11th century, the spices were from East Asia, and medieval cooking was undeniably a fusion of Western techniques with Eastern ingredients. again, as an indication of how far-flung these trade networks could be. Let me share another recipe with you. This is remarkable. It comes from the earliest medieval cookbook. This is called the Libellus de Arte Coquinaria. It just means a little book on the art of cookery. The original is in Latin. It doesn't exist anymore, but it survives in these 4 different translations. Really interesting. 2 are in Low German, 1 is in Danish, and the other is in Icelandic. Okay, so this is a sauce for lords. Man skal takai gjora fors naglayak muskat. Oh, you don't read it Icelandic. Sorry, let me translate that. No, I won't translate it. But it says that the one takes cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, pepper, cinnamon, cannelle, ginger, all in equal amounts, and then vinegar and breadcrumbs are added, and it basically makes a thick sauce. But what this means is that a clove grown on the island of Ternate was being enjoyed by a Viking in Iceland, 7,702 miles away. And a sauce that really is inspired by Asian cuisine, if you think about it. It's a fusion. Breadcrumbs are European, but not the rest of it. So my larger point is that Western cooking, especially in the Middle Ages, was thoroughly imbued with Asian ingredients precisely because Europeans associated them with the exotic and the Far East. And they weren't exactly sure where they came from. Somewhere around China, they called that Cathay, or maybe Chipangu, which was their name for Japan. And of course, there was an intense desire to make direct contact with the fabled empire, the Great Khan. And a couple of people did it, actually went all the way. You probably know Marco Polo. And in case you're wondering, when Marco Polo got to China, he saw noodles there, and he said, wow, they have macaroni just like we have. Okay? He didn't bring them back. They were already in Italy. So whether, there was some earlier, older connection, that could certainly be possible, but, and noodles could definitely have traveled east to west, but it would have been long before Marco Polo. In any case, the desire to make direct contact with the East, to find spices and other luxury goods, prompted a series of overseas expeditions. The Chinese actually might have been the first to reach Europe. There were ships that went from China all the way to the coast of Africa under Zheng He in the 15th century, but they stopped after that. So, of course, Columbus was the one who was trying to get to China by sailing west and accidentally bumped into America. But until his dying day, he thought he had landed on islands just adjacent to Asia. He really didn't know he discovered a new continent, which is amazing to me. But I think more importantly than this is the direct contact made by the Portuguese in Asia. So let me spend a little time just talking about that. The first Portuguese to make direct contact in Asia were traders, soldiers, missionaries. They arrived, in fact, not to subdue Asia at all, which probably would have been impossible, but merely to set up trading posts, or what they call feitoria. It's sort of like the word factory. It's a trading post from which they could pick up goods and, of course, send out missionaries. The places they landed still retain a very strong culinary imprint of their presence. Think of Goa, think of Malacca, think of Macau, even think of Japan, which, the one that I always love is this sponge cake that you find in any Japanese convenience store, the word kazutera, which is the word is pan castilla. It's just a sort of yellow sponge cake that comes from Castile, from Spain. Or the words carumera or competo. All these are things the Portuguese introduced into Japan. So, or think of, a pastéis de nata, which is the little egg custard that you find in any dim sum restaurant. That is, you find that in Angola, you find that in Brazil. It's pretty much global. But when the Portuguese arrived in Japan, they were not, as we might imagine, the more sophisticated culture. In fact, exactly the opposite. The Portuguese were the ones who were made fun of by the more advanced Japanese. And what I find most amazing and fascinating is that European explorers themselves recognized Asian food culture as being more sophisticated. Let me give you one little account. It's by this, it's a book called Peregrinations by this guy named Fernão Mendes Pinto. And he goes to Japan in 1546, and there are some remarkable descriptions of the food. He talks about how people are so generous. They bring him rice and fruit and boiled fish. And toward the end of his peregrinations, on a return voyage, he and some companions are invited to this feast by a king, who he knows at this point. And the king decides to use this occasion to get a good laugh by requesting that the Portuguese eat in their own manner. Okay, now what does that mean? And for 1549, it means with your hands. Okay, so Mendes Pintos, let me quote him here. He says, whereas we were then at a treasurer's house where we were appointed to lodge, and he sent for us 5 and entreated us that we should eat in his presence in the manner of our country, adding that the queen did infinitely desire it. Then, having caused a table to be covered for us, he placed on it a store of excellent good meat, and well dressed, which was served up by fair women, and we fell to eating after our own manner, all of what was set before us. And meanwhile, the jests with the ladies broke upon us. In seeing us feed with our hands, it gave more delight to the king and queen than all the comedies that could have been presented before them. So the people are cracking up watching the Portuguese eat with their hands. And he says, these people being accustomed to feed with 2 little sticks, as I've declared elsewhere, they hold it for a great incivility to touch meat with their hands, as we do. And the Japanese, the guests, they take the joke a little bit too far. They invite some people in dressed as merchants with bags, and they pull out of it these little arms with fingers on the end. And he says, why don't you try these instead, and maybe your fingers won't smell of whatever you've been eating. And Mendes is like really getting angry now that they've gone too far, but they make up and everything is fine in the end. But I think the more interesting point to be made in this is that Mendes Pinto, when he was describing this whole story, began to realize, yeah, it is kind of disgusting to eat with your hands, and the Japanese table manners are a lot more sophisticated. So let me give you one more little account. This is a description of Japan by a Jesuit, João Rodrigues, who was there through the late 16th century and stayed until about 1610. And he gives us a really full account. It's the first full account by a Westerner of the Kaiseki Ryori. And he was clearly struck by the whole beauty and the elegance of the whole thing. And this is what he says. Far from being excessive and abundant, the banquet is very sober and moderate. Each guest eats and drinks soberly as much as he pleases without having to be persuaded, nor do the guests converse among themselves while eating, but they say only what is necessary and in a low voice. Great modesty and tranquility are observed in everything. And the direct implication for his readers is that European habits in eating are completely the opposite, where there's a lot of noise, people have to be induced to drink too much, and the food is excessive and abundant. And I think, the evidence for that is very clear. There's a wonderful cookbook of the same time called the Arte de Cocina, which is by a guy named Domingos Rodrigues. I don't think they're related at all, but it attests to exactly that. Enormous portions of food, dozens and dozens of courses, meat, fowl, pastries, confections in every single course. And he's saying, look how well the Japanese do it compared to us. So he says this, while in Japan there is no pomp or splendor involved, as Joao explains, the intention is to contemplate nature. This is sort of interesting that 400 years ago, he's picking up on this aesthetic. He says the setting for this meal is simple and rustic. The utensils are of clay or iron, not precious metal. And the real marvel for him, I think again, in contrast to European customs, is how clean everything is. He says this, above all else, they pay more attention than can be easily imagined to the cleanliness of everything, however small it may be in this rustic and ancient setting. And he says that the thing that really amazes me is that the Japanese pay enormous sums of money for the simplest earthenware vessel. I think he's thinking of something like a raku bowl, which the people who make them are considered national living treasures in Japan. And he's amazed that they can appreciate this sort of wobbly, offset tea bowl. So my larger point is that for Europeans, Asian cooking was not just exotic or strange. It was a cuisine that was in many ways far more refined than their own, one that provided a foil for excesses of courtly cooking in the West, and it was a cuisine that they could admire and appreciate. And I would also contend that at this point, the flavor combinations in each cuisine were based on basically the same principles. Food should be comprised of ingredients and textures that contrast in some very fundamental way, so that in a dish, you will find combinations of sweet, sour, savory, spicy, as well as contrasting colors, contrasting textures, aromas. And I would call, I'm going to invent a word here, if you'll indulge me. I'm going to call it polysaporic. meaning sapor meaning flavor, poly meaning lots of different flavors working against each other, contrasting, a lot like polyphony, right? That's different musical lines contrasting. So let me give you two more recipes that are from opposite ends of the Eurasian continent to illustrate this point, that Asian and Western cuisine are very, very close at this point. First is a late medieval Chinese recipe. This is from the Yinshan Cheng Yao. I think I've said that right. It's a Hu Shu Wei. He says that to make this recipe, it is in fact a noodle soup. So this is why I'm obsessing about this sort of thing. So he says start with 10 fat chickens, debone them, cut them up, boil, then afterward remove them from the broth and fry them. It's very common actually in medieval cooking to do two different techniques like this, as it is still in Asian. He then adds to this ground ginger, Sichuan pepper, vermicelli made of wheat flour, and the broth is added back in, and then onions, vinegar, ginger juice at the end. Now let me go back to Rodrigues, the cookbook author, the Portuguese one. This is a recipe for frangaus com fideos, which is basically birds. He says you can make it with chicken too, with fideos. It's thin little vermicelli noodles. He says 2 birds, he's making it for less people, I guess, are boiled with some tocino, which is bacon, vinegar, noodles are added to the broth, and then spices, ginger, pepper, cloves, and then squeeze some lemon on before serving. So one coming from China, the other from Portugal, they're almost the same. And this is before the point of contact. Okay, so there's no influence of the two upon each other. So the question is, what happened that Asian cooking would once again become exotic and strange in the early modern period, and ultimately to Americans too, who, first of all, the Japanese kicked the Portuguese out, okay, because they got fed up with their missionary activity, and they invited the Dutch in instead, kept them on a little island off of Nagasaki and said, you're not allowed to set foot on Japanese soil, and of course, Japan closes off to the West entirely. I think more importantly, though, is that European cooking veered off in many, many significant ways. This happens in the 17th and 18th century when a new kind of cuisine was invented by the French. In French haute cuisine, it begins with La Varenne and Massaialot and a handful of other cookbook authors. Rather than having contrasting flavors, remember this polysaporic idea that I was talking about? That flavors should harmonize, that you should make the sauce from the same main ingredient. You should make a stock from the bones of the chicken and serve it on that chicken or whatever. Garnishes should complement rather than contrast. Spices are banished from food. Sweetness is put to the end of the whole meal. And a very strict order of courses leading from delicate to more full-flavored dishes becomes the rule. So in other words, classical haute cuisine banished completely that spicy, sour, pungent, fragrant preference that is late medieval cuisine. And by the 19th century, French cuisine pretty much dominated everywhere in Europe and America, at least in fine dining. There was a system of professional training through apprenticeships, celebrity chefs like Carême, all the way up to Escoffier. And all this coincided with the Industrial Revolution, with dramatic population growth, the growth of cities as well, and of course, restaurants where patrons could go to see people and to be seen. And naturally, restaurants competed with each other. You know, that sort of acts as a goad to fashion and to changing tastes. So chefs are always trying to invent something new to attract customers. And that's basically where the larger West, stood in 1850. Now, here's the contrast, is that Asia did not industrialize. In fact, European powers had forced most of Asia to trade, beginning with the Opium Wars in China, later gunboats showing up with Admiral Perry in Japan, and after, again, about 200 years of isolation, soon the French would show up in Indochine, what is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. The Dutch had long taken Indonesia from the Portuguese. The Spanish had been in the Philippines since 1570, connecting Manila directly with Acapulco. And all these places, they're developed fusion cuisine, right, that were eventually exported back to Europe. So, and they became popular there precisely because they were exotic and daring and featured these flavor combinations that had been long forgotten back in Europe. And the situation in America was quite different. Asians, and of course it's by and large Chinese to start with, arrived in a massive wave during the California Gold Rush. This was largely because, although Asia had experienced a population boom very much like everywhere on Earth, there was no industry to absorb the excess population, so it made sense for people just to leave, to earn a living mining or laying down railroad track. And I think this was a really appealing option for younger sons who wouldn't inherit the family property. Just go out and make your fortune, maybe even go home if you can afterwards. I think it's crucial to understand that these were mostly men. Okay? Not a whole lot of women came to start with. And many of them, of course, never made it in mining, which is precisely why they ended up opening these establishments to provide services for other recent immigrants, as everyone, of course, was to California, except Native Americans. So they opened laundries and restaurants and other services. And so by 1853, this is just a few years, really, San Francisco had a well-delineated Chinese quarter with many restaurants. Now, as I mentioned, this community faced extreme hostility. The legal discrimination, they also had this deliberate strategy to win over non-Asian customers, and it was in fact through food. This involved really clever advertising. I read one story where a restaurant sent food over to the editorial offices of a newspaper. It just didn't say anything. It just said, here, try it. And of course, they mentioned how good it was. And of course, they adapted Asian recipes to suit Anglo palates. Again, what I would call evolution of the cuisine. Now, to counter prevailing stereotypes, they also maintained strict cleanliness, they offered prompt service, they offered competitive prices, and let me give you an account. This is 1851, a guy named William Kelly. He says, the Celestials, that's what they call the Chinese, I'm not sure why, the Celestials carried off the palm for superior excellence in every particular. They serve everything promptly, cleanly, hot, well cooked. They give dishes particular to each nation over above their own particular soups, curries, ragouts. He doesn't even know what they're called. He calls them ragouts, but all right. Which cannot even be imitated elsewhere. In other words, you have to go to a Chinese restaurant. And such is their quickness and civil attention, they anticipate your wants and then secure your patronage. So the cuisine wasn't so much exotic as unique and served really well. And most importantly, as in all these accounts, it was affordable. The restaurateurs were clearly trying to offer the customers anything they wanted. And this is characteristic of Chinese restaurants, I think, for the next century, especially as they spread across the country. Their adaptability to people's desires and their great prices. And this, of course, was a blessing as well as a curse. You could not open a high-end Chinese restaurant. It was just no such thing. And this, I think, applied to every other Asian immigrant group as well. The restaurants might be excellent, but they could not break this upscale market. Now, I'm not sure the Asian restaurant owners themselves had some kind of inferiority complex, but the perception was that the lack of professional training, the simple decor, having no wine list, lacking a mass of critical reviewers, all meant that these could not be considered serious restaurants. There was no body of gastronomic literature available in English. So Asian cuisines for much of the 20th century were locked into a certain formula. They had to serve stock classic dishes and a set repertoire, and they had to be cheap. Classical training, reviewed restaurants, gastronomic writing was always about France and maybe some other European countries, or maybe an American regional cuisine. But how did this change? How did Asian cuisine get a foothold both in cooking schools and in the gastronomic imagination, and even be leaders in innovation in restaurants? Well, I think it is first Asian cooking became familiar through cookbooks. The first Asian cookbook published in the U.S. is actually really bad. I'm sorry to say. It's called the Chinese-Japanese Cookbook, 1914, by Sarah Bossi and Onoto Watana. Its authors say they say Oriental dishes may sound strange and repugnant, but will appeal to American households if only tried. Now, these people, I don't think they had any idea what they were talking about. One thing is Watana, her real name was Winifred Eaton. So she kind of made this up and, pretended to be Japanese. But from my own work, I've been writing about community cookbooks lately, and what strikes me is that these are community cookbooks from Stockton, which is just inland from here. And the recipes, things that they will call chop suey, are just unfathomable. Like, you think this is spaghetti and hamburger and chopped onions and soy sauce put in a pan and shaked up. One recipe, I love this one. This is a chop suey that has peas, carrots, mushrooms, celery, sugar, slices of bacon, Worcestershire sauce, and pork shoulder simmered for half an hour. I don't know where they got the idea to call that chop suey, but okay. So its authenticity is actually beside the point. American customers were gradually introduced to recipes actually eaten in China. Regional cuisines, Szechuan and Hunan, came in about the 70s or 80s. Perversely enough, I think also mass-produced Asian food, first in cans and then in bottled sauces, are what's kind of awoke people to the possibilities. You know, when I was growing up, everyone knew that jingle, La Choy makes Chinese food, swing American. You remember this? It's sort of, you know, stuck in our heads. It was the worst stuff. But restaurants started opening, even Japanese restaurants. Remember Benihana in the 70s. Sushi restaurants began to appear. And I think, you know, one could very easily trace a procession of Asian cuisines. First Vietnamese and Thai. Even oddly, there's not a large Thai community in the United States, but Thai restaurants are everywhere. Vietnamese, Korean, and these, of course, most of these derived from the actual immigrant communities. But there followed cookbooks, supermarkets that stock Asian ingredients, and I think anyone interested in Asian cuisines who lived through that era, like I did, learned to cook mostly from Martin Yan. There's no doubt about that. I certainly did. In fact, I still count when I'm cutting up things, you know, 1, 2, there. So in any case, there were still no high-end Asian restaurants, and gastronomic writers, restaurant reviewers paid very little attention, and I think this changed when the ascendancy of French cuisine began to slip. When French chefs themselves started adopting Asian ingredients and aesthetics. They took out the classic sauces and laden with butter. They looked at fresh vegetables. The long simmered stocks disappeared. And all of a sudden, this brightness of citrus and chili peppers, and the food world really began to notice. And it's because the Europeans really started to take on Asian ingredients and techniques. The searing heat, the pungency, the aromatics, exactly those flavors that they had 300 years before. So what I'm arguing is that it's a rediscovery. It's not a discovery at all. It's really, I think the way to really think about fusion cuisine is it's more a reunion of long-lost cousins. And I will stop there. Thanks. Do we have time for questions? Okay. I think we have time for questions, so I'm not sure how we'll do this, but do you want to moderate? We have a moderator, so go ahead, Josh.
I think we've got time for one or two questions, probably. And we're bringing some mics out right now, so they're going to set those up. If there's anybody who has questions, they're going to bring these right to the front, if I can see. Otherwise, I'll start Ken off with a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So one of the things that you've done here really well is sort of unpack this binary of how distinct East and West are. And I'm wondering, thinking about the patterns and the growths of it, whether this is a sort of call and response kind of thing in a way, that historically it moves from a moment of fusion to a moment of authenticity and back, or is it really, do we seem to see them going simultaneously, do you think?
Ooh, that's a really big question. The way I like to see it is really in oscillations. I think that in general, I think this is true of all cuisines, is they go through these patterns of having very complex, very intellectualized, very scientific kind of cooking, as we of course had in the 80s, and that people kind of get tired of that. And then they want things that are traditional and rustic and homemade and simple and comforting, and I think we're entering into a period like that now. And that changes every, I don't know, sometimes it's a century, as nowadays it seems to be every 10, 15 years that it goes back. But I think that the interest in the exotic and authentic is indicative of those periods where there's elaboration of cuisine and they're looking for different ingredients and techniques. And then when they pull back, I think that, I don't know, I'm going to try and answer this more fully, but I think that oscillation between really complex and really simple cuisine has a lot to do with whether you accept exotic ingredients or you pull away from them. That's I think what I want to say.
Great, thank you. If I can ask you to just come over to one of the two mics, that'd be great. It should be on in 1 second. Just keep speaking. Yeah.
How does time or throughout the ages influence food? As a matter of fact, you know, French cuisine is so labor intensive, making it many ways.
Yeah.
But now we have, you know, a lighter broth, or we have an Asian influence.
I could have screamed a lot louder. Sorry, guys. But anyways, so how does our time, as we evaluate and everybody talks about, what our time throughout the ages and French cuisine being so labor intensive, and now, as we get into the industrial period and now our, millennial period, nobody has time to, make a demi-glaze over hours, and now Asian influences are fast, fresh, quick. I'm interested in your take on that.
You're really talking about economics here. If you have patrons who have insurmountable amounts of cash, they will spend it on employment. They'll hire more people, and then you'll have long simmered stocks, and you'll have expensive ingredients that come from far away. When you see the economy contract, then they start cutting labor, and they start looking for quicker ways to do things. And of course, a squirt of lime juice is much easier than a stock reduction. So I would say that basically follows this pattern that I've been talking about. Right now, I think the trend is to simplify the kitchen, and not spend so much time. Whereas in the 80s, you remember stacked food? It was really labor intensive. The fact that a tweezer could become a kitchen implement amazes me. Placing food minutely like that, no one has the labor to do that anymore. Maybe Thomas Keller still does, but not many people, I think.
Thanks. I think we're actually out of time, so if you can join me in thanking Ken for what I think was really a rewarding talk about tradition and innovation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ken and Josh, for that very interesting kickoff to our next 3 days, setting the scene for what we're about to experience at this conference. I'm Cathy Jörin, and as Greg mentioned, I have had the pleasure of planning the program for this conference over the past year with Anne McBride. I'm very excited to introduce the next session, From the Time-Honored to the Avant-Garde, a spotlight on Japan. Japanese cuisine continues to be at the forefront of culinary influence and popularity in American food service. I was also fortunate to plan the 2010 Worlds of Flavor Conference with Greg Drescher, Japan Flavors of Culture, and through that process met many chefs from Japan. As a result of that conference, the chefs that came here, which were over 40 from Japan, formed a group called Team of Japan, really an unprecedented group of chefs in Japan. That group has since changed and grown into a new organization called Soul of Japan, which has been formed to promote Japanese cuisine throughout the world. And that organization is under the direction of Mr. Shikarashi, who is a CIA ambassador in Japan. Especially important for the promotion of Japanese cuisine with that group is because of the recent recognition of Japanese cuisine as a World Heritage to be preserved by UNESCO. In addition, in 2010, the next moderator of our program worked closely with us on the planning of the program because he spent a lot of time in Japan. So now I'd like to introduce Kyle Connaughton. Sorry. Kyle Connaughton grew up in Los Angeles, cooking for a number of top restaurants. He attended the Southern California School of Culinary Arts and 2 Japanese culinary schools before working for the Japanese outpost of Michel Bras, the 3 Michelin star restaurant based in La Guiole, France. While in Japan, Kyle also worked in several of the top kitchens of traditional kaiseki, sushi, soba, and izakaya-style dining. He then moved to the UK to open the Fat Duck Experimental Kitchen with Heston Blumenthal. After 5 years in the UK, Kyle returned to the US to work on several development projects, including contributing to the Modernist Cuisine book series. Other projects have included program and curriculum development for the Culinary Institute of America's new Culinary Science Bachelor's Degree program, and Kyle is also the founder now of his new Pilot R&D, a development and culinary science-based consulting firm. In addition, he's opening his own new restaurant, Single Thread, a farm restaurant and inn in the summer of 2015, this year, in Healdsburg, California. And he's also currently writing a book on Japanese earthenware, which will be published later this year. Kyle will be leading a workshop on donabe, the Japanese earthenware cooking, later in this conference. Please welcome Kyle Connaughton.
Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. Very excited about this year's World of Flavor. It's amazing collection of chefs this year. And we're very fortunate to have 3 really outstanding chefs for this session to really start kicking things off here. And I want to give them the maximum amount of time, so I'm going to let our first chef get started. Very excited that the first chef is back again this year. Hisato Nakahigashi-san is the 4th generation chef and owner of Miyamaso, which is out in the mountains outside of Kyoto. And Miyamaso is very famous for, and Nakahigashi-san is very famous for, their style of kaiseki cuisine, which they refer to often as tsumikusa ryori, which sort of loosely translates to gathered herb cooking. So quite a bit of foraging, quite a bit of wild foods, quite a bit of what's called sansai, Japanese wild mountain vegetables. And he's going to speak to you a little bit about that and some of his dishes.
Those 聞こえてますでしょうか。私ですね、京都のですね、山の中、花瀬という場所にあります宮間荘というレストランから、やってまいりました中東久人と申します。よろしくお願いいたします。
Hello, can you hear me? My name is Hisato Nakahigashi. I have come from Kyoto in the mountain, in a town called Hanase. I run a restaurant called Miyamaso.
で私はですね今回この、ナパに来させていただく、CIA に来させていただいたのがですね、2010年、と、今年合わせ2回目になります。そしてまたここに2回訪れさせていただいた、そのご縁があったことをですね非常に嬉しく思っております。
This is my second time at this Culinary Institute of America. The first time was in 2010, and this is my second time. I feel very fortunate and very happy that I had the opportunity and the good luck to be able to come here.
はい、では、挨拶はこれぐらいにしましてですね、本題に入っていきたいと思います。本日私はですね、日本の春の香りということをですねテーマに、話を進めさせていただきたいと思います。
So much for the introduction. I'd like to move on to the main topic. Today I would like to talk to you about spring scents.
はい、まずですね日本人というのはですね、どういう民族か、日本人というのはですね非常に自然を尊ぶ、すごくその、民族でございまして、で、その自然からですねさまざまな文化を生み出してきました。例えば、器、そして、陶器ですよね。陶器、そして漆、そして建築もそうですし、あとお庭とかもそうですし、自然がなければ、生み出せなかったものばかりでございます。
Now let me tell you a little bit about the Japanese people. The Japanese people respect nature very much. In fact, it is from nature that a lot of our culture arises. Without nature, we would not have our pottery, or we would not have our lacquerware, our housing construction, or our gardens.
はい、そんなですね、日本はですねその自然が、豊かなところなんですけれども、そういう自然が豊かな、ところでですね、私は、料理をしております。その料理っていうのがどういう料理かと言いますと、私、スタイルで言いますと摘み草料理という料理でございます。
Now, the Japanese love nature and they are surrounded by nature, and I am cooking amongst nature. The type of cooking that I do is mountain foraging, herb foraging.
そうです。そのまま摘み草料理と覚えていただいたらいいと思います。
And I think you can now learn a new word, tsumikusa cooking.
Yes. そんな中ですね、毎日私はですね、山の中に入って、その日の、いわゆるその自然の空気感ですね、その、食材を摘む、取るということだけではなく、その日の、自然の空気感ですね、そういったものを感じに山に入ります。そしてそれを、感じたものをその日のお皿に、表現していきます。
Every day I go into the mountains and I look and I forage for these herbs, but I'm not only going there to find ingredients for food, I'm also there in order to feel the air, to feel the atmosphere. And the atmosphere that I feel in nature there is what I will bring back to my kitchen and turn into the food that I prepare that day.
そうです。で、摘み草料理のその摘み草という言葉なんですけれども、その摘み草という言葉はですね、日本でいう平安時代、今から1300年ほど前ですね、の貴族の遊びだったんですね。で、その貴族さんたちは、日本には四季があります。で、冬は雪が降ります。そして雪解けとともにですね、春を迎えたその新芽ですね、それを見て、春が来たなということで季節感を感じ感動して歌にしたりとかして遊んでたような感じです。だからそういったその優雅なですね、貴族の遊びというものをですね、現代宮間荘では、現代流にですね、料理を提供しているわけですね。
Now, gathering herbs is not just in order to get ingredients. 1300 years ago, this was a way for the nobility to enjoy the sense of season. It snows in the winter, and then as the snow melts in the spring, they start seeing new buds come out. Seeing the new buds make them feel, oh, it's spring now, and the sense of joy for the changing seasons. They would then write poems to talk about that. And gathering herbs was also one type of their enjoyment as well. This type of an elegant enjoyment or pastime among the upper class is something that I have turned into more of a modern cuisine in my restaurant.
そうです。ですから摘み草料理っていうのは、日本人のですね、心の、ふるさとであるようなですね、料理ですね。そういった料理を皆さんに提供できるように、努力して、努力というか精進しております。
So this gathered herb cuisine, in a sense, is the embodiment of the Japanese heart and soul when they feel a longing for going back home, and that is what I'm trying to express through my cooking.
はい、ということでですね、先ほどもお話ししたようにですね、今日本はね春真っ盛りでございます。ですからですね、本日はですね、その春の日本の香りを、凝縮したような料理を、皆様に、お伝えしたいと思います。
As I mentioned earlier, we are in the midst of spring in Japan right now. So the dish that I would like to introduce to you today is a concentration of the spring scent in Japan.
はい、本日ですね、ちょっとご用意させていただいたんですけれども、みんなご覧に なられてますでしょうか。
Can you see the dish that I have prepared for you?
こういったものですね、本当にごく一部でございますね。これはうどというものであったり、ふきのとうというものであったり、こごみであったり、たらの芽であったり、まだまだたくさん種類はたくさんあります。で、この春の野草が持つ特徴というのはですね、やはりその香りですね。すごくいい香りがします。で、この香りと食べたらですね、ほんのり甘い、苦みが特徴ですね。
Here I have a variety of different kinds of Japanese wild vegetables and herbs. I have udo, I have butterbur shoots and other things. But the characteristic of these types of mountain herbs, and there are many, many more than these, is that they have wonderful scent. They're very fragrant. And if you bite into it, it has a little bit of bitterness with a sweetness.
こういったものをですね、調理していくわけなんですけれども、やはりですね、その香りがあるということでですね、その香りっていうものはどうしても揮発性でございますので逃げていきます。ですからその香りを閉じ込めるために本日はですね、こういう宝書焼きというその紙ですね、特別な紙があります。その紙で、例えばそうですね、本日はですね、食材として、こちらはキングサーモンですね。日本では桜マスというのを使います。ちょうどこの季節、ちょっと本当に脂がたくさん乗ったマスが、川を登ってきます。それをですね、まず、お味噌ですね。お味噌、みりん、酒、醤油ですね。これをですね、合わします。これを合わしますと、ここにですね、うまみたっぷりの、液体ができます。これですね。
Now these mountain vegetables, these wild herbs are very fragrant, but because their fragrances, because their scents, they do tend to evaporate or the scent tends to go away. So in order to try to maintain and keep the scent within the cooking, we use this special paper, Hoshu Japanese paper. And today I am going to be cooking king salmon. In Japan it's cherry salmon, but this is the time when the king salmon are swimming up the rivers, so they are very fatty and very rich. I have made a marinade using miso, mirin, sake, and shoyu, which are together very full of umami.
はい。お味噌でもですね、日本にはいろいろな種類のお味噌があります。その中でですね、本日使うのは、粗味噌というものですね。粗味噌というものはですね、白味噌という、お味噌がありまして、これは京都でよく使う非常にその塩分濃度が少ない、お味噌甘いお味噌なんですけれども、それが出来上がる、一段階前の、ちょっとこう荒々しいお味噌ですね。
Now, the miso that I'm going to be using is a coarse miso. There are a lot of different kinds of and types of miso in Japan, but there is also the coarse miso that I'm going to be using today. The white miso is what is commonly or very often used in Kyoto. This has very low sodium and is sweet. And it is a miso that is one step prior to the completed miso stage.
なぜこういったものを使うかということをですね、皆さんはお知りになられたいと、思います。まず味噌なんですけれども、非常にこれは京都の場合米ですね、米を、原料にして作っております。そして、これに塩を、蒸して、そして、塩を当てて熟成させていくわけなんですけれども、熟成していくうちにですね、どんどんこのアミノ酸が増えていってうまみがたくさん乗ってきます。でも、この白味噌の場合は他のもっと色がついたお味噌よりも非常にそのうまみ成分は少ないです。その代わり、塩分濃度も少なくてですね、非常に甘いので、料理が辛くならないですね。
You probably want to know why I chose the ingredients that I did. For the miso, the Kyoto miso are based on rice, which is fermented with salt, and after it becomes mature, it is really full of amino acid, which has a lot of umami in it. The white miso has less umami than the dark-colored miso, but because it has less sodium and is sweeter, it does not add too much saltiness to the food.
はい。そして、皆さんもご存知のみりんでございますよね。これもうまみがたっぷり入ったその甘みをつける、調味料でございます。
And then the mirin is a ingredient that I add. It adds sweetness while also containing a lot of umami.
そして、こちらが日本酒でございます。日本酒にもですね、非常にうまみがたくさん入っておりまして、いわゆるこちらは琥珀酸というのが、たくさん含まれていて、で、うまみといってもですね、その日本のうまみの場合はですね、複雑なうまみではなく、非常に透明感のあるうまみでございます。で、それを、助けるのに、この日本酒というのも使っていきます。
Now, the Japanese sake, of course, there are many different kinds of sake and different alcohol degrees as well. But this also has a type of acid that has umami in it. But it's not a very complex umami. It has clarity to it. So that is the reason why I use that.
はい。で、そして、お醤油でございますね。お醤油もうまみがたくさんありまして。で、なぜお醤油を入れるのかというと、こちらの白味噌、粒味噌の方がですね、そんなに塩分濃度が高くないので、こちらの方で少しうまみのある塩分を補っていきます。
Then I also add soy sauce, which also has a lot of umami. The reason why I'm adding soy sauce is because the white crushed miso is very low in sodium and it's not very salty. So in order to add saltiness to the food while also adding umami, I use the soy sauce.
そして忘れてはいけないのはですね、皆様これは柚子に見えますか？これはレモンなんですけれども、こちらには柚子というものがないので、本日は、レモンを代用させていただきました。で、こういったうまみばっかりですと口の中がもったりしてきます。ですからこういうふうな酸味ですね、酸味であるとか爽やかな香りをここに、リキッドの中に入れることによって、さっぱりと、 脂っこい、サクラマスであるとかキングサーモンが食べれます。
Now, what I just showed you, does that look like a yuzu to you? In fact, because I could not find yuzu here, I'm using lemon instead. But normally I would use yuzu instead. The reason why I'm adding yuzu is because when all of this, the marinade is made with all of these ingredients rich in umami, it makes it a bit heavy. So in order to add a little bit of lightness and acidity, I add the liquid, add the yuzu, or the lemon in this case, in order to make it as a counterbalance to the richer salmon.
はい、それをですね、合わせたものがこちらでございます。で、こちらにですね、この先ほどのこのキングサーモンですね、これを漬け込んでいきます。
So this is the marinade that is made of all the ingredients that I explained, and I will add the king salmon to the marinade.
これで約24時間ここで漬けときます。
I marinate it for approximately 24 hours.
で、漬け上がったものがこちらでございますね。
And then this is what I get.
ですね、ここの下に置くちょっとまな板が汚れてしまうので、このようにこう。
I'll just show it to you this way because if I put it down on the board, it'll make the board dirty.
はい。でですね、まずですね、最初のこの生の状態、よりもやはりその味噌とか、お醤油とかこういったものによってですね、どんどん脱水されて少しちっちゃくなります。でも、ちっちゃくなっても、ちっちゃくなってもではなく、その分その水分が、ちっちゃくなるということは水分が抜けてうまみが凝縮するということですね。で、うまみが凝縮するということだけではなくてですね、この日本酒のアルコールによってこの味噌とかみりんとか醤油のこのうまみがですね、どんどん身の中に浸透しやすくなるわけですね。
Now, compared to the freshly cut salmon, the salmon that had been marinated becomes smaller because of the liquid being taken out of it through the miso and the soy sauce. That will concentrate the umami, but it will not only concentrate the umami, the Japanese sake that is used will make the umami much more, go into the body of the salmon much better.
そして、漬け上がったものをですね、だいたい 60% ぐらいオーブンでこう焼いていきます。で、焼けたものが、こちらでございますね。
Then I would take the marinated salmon and put it in the oven and cook it to approximately
60% ぐらいの焼き加
cook
減
it for about 60%. Cook it about 60% of the way, and that is what this will be.
はい。でですね、こういったこう調味料の特性としてですね、つけた後焼くとですね、非常にこう照りが出てピカッと光ってこう綺麗にこう見えますね。
Thanks to the ingredients that I use, these condiments that I use, the salmon will cook up to have a nice gloss on it.
はい。で、これを、60% ぐらい焼いたものをですね、今度は、先ほどの、春の山菜ですね、本日はですね、この山菜は全部一応下湯がきしてございます。で、下湯がきして少し塩を振ってございます。
To the salmon that I have cooked to about 60% done, I will then add the gathered herbs, the spring vegetables that I showed you earlier. I have already parboiled them a little bit and added salt to them.
はい。で、仕上げに入りたいと思います。あとはですね、これを包丁で包んでいくんですけれどもですね、こちらが包書紙というものです。
Then I will start wrapping the ingredients together, first of all with the hosho paper.
で、包書紙に直接乗せますと、この包書紙が魚のお汁とかで汚れてしまいますので、一度ここに、クッキングシートというものを引きます。
If I put the fish directly onto the hosho paper, then the paper will end up discoloring. So I first put a piece of cooking paper on it.
そしてこちら杉板というものです。これは杉をですね、薄く、スライスしたものですね。
Then
非
I
常
also
にこう
have,
いい香りがします。
then I also have a slice of cedar paper, which has a beautiful scent.
これをですね、一度この日本酒 にこうつけます。そうするとこの加熱している間にですね、この日本酒がですね、どんどんこう蒸発していって、でこの中でこの包装の中で蒸し焼きという状態になっていきます。
I then dip the cedar paper in sake. After I dip it, I put it inside, and as this is cooking in the hosho paper, the evaporated sake will then steam the fish inside.
はい。で、これをですね、乗せていきます。まずこの上にサーモンを乗せます。
First, I will put the salmon on this.
そしてこの盛り付けの時に重要なのがですね、ここでどれだけその春の野を演出できるかということですね。
Important point about plating is how much of the sense of spring I can display in putting them together.
であんまりね、その野草ってのワイルドなものっていうのはですね、整然とは生えておりません。本当にこうあっち向いたりこっち向いたりして、生きておりますので、そういうふうな、こう言ったらその生物たちが、生育している環境を見るっていうのはその非常にこう盛り付けに役立つわけですね。
Wild vegetables, of course, don't grow in a straight line. They grow looking this way and that. And looking at the way these vegetables grow in nature is really a very good hint and gives a lot of inspiration in how to plate the dish.
そして柚子の皮を少しちぎってここに忍ばせます。
And I add a very small zest of the yuzu.
で、これを、包んでいきます。
Now I will wrap this.
まあ、包み方もね、私もよく間違えるんですけれども、まず下を上げていただいて、で今度は横通ってくるっと丸めて、ちょうどこの部分ですね、この部分にくるっとこう折り込んでいただいて、しっかりとここで折り目をつけていただきます。
I don't always do this correctly either, but first you pull up the bottom part and then fold in the sides, and in the top where there is a little space, I tuck in the top portion and make sure that I put a good crease in it.
はい。で、あとはですね、オーブンで、このように焼き上げるわけでございますね。
Then this is baked in the oven.
少しまあ焦げ目がついてた方が、なんとなく焼き物だなというような感じがするので、ほんのりと焦げ目をつけてください。あんまり焼きすぎるとボーッと燃えてしまいますので気をつけてください。
When the paper is singed a little bit, then it does give this sense of this is something that really has been baked. So that's why I try to actually put a little bit of singeing in the paper. But if you do too much of that, then it'll flame up, and you don't want the whole thing to burn.
で、これが出来上がりましたら、ちょっとこう大きめの器ですね、こういったものにですね、その季節のですね、こう非常にこう美しい、まあ、リーフなんかをですね取ってきて、ここに乗せまして季節感を出していきます。
Then in order to plate this, I will take a larger bowl and take a beautiful leaf that is seasonal from nature and put this in so it does feel like spring.
で、このように、春の料理の一品ができました。ありがとうございます。
So this is the spring cooking.
The kaiseki en papillote technique. It's brilliant. So, today the subject we're talking about, this sort of movement of the traditional to the avant-garde cuisine. So what we're seeing is a restaurant, kaiseki restaurant, with 500 years of history. Like I said, Nakahigashi-san's fourth generation chef owner. So, very traditional, but also very forward-thinking. I was very fortunate in my early 20s to work at his second restaurant, also called Miyamoso, in Hokkaido, and it was such an amazing experience to cook in his kitchen. And when he walked in the first time and saw me in his kitchen, he was surprised to see an American chef there, but really enjoyed cooking his cuisine. It's something very special. If you have the chance to go to Kyoto, to get out of what is really a great food town in Japan, but to get out in the mountains and visit Miyamoso and kind of experience their omotenashi hospitality, their special hospitality between the cuisine and the inn and the mountains that surround them. It's sort of truly a very special place. So next up we have really kind of the newer generation of Japanese cuisine chef in Japan, Zaiyu Hasegawa-san, who has a restaurant he opened 29 called Jimbocho Den, which has 2 Michelin stars. And was speaking earlier today with Hasegawa-san about his cuisine and what he's trying to convey with his cuisine. He's got, in many ways, 1 foot in the tradition and sort of 1 foot in the modern, but his goal was really to make Japanese cuisine, washoku cuisine, kaiseki cuisine, more approachable and more familiar, both for foreigners and for Japanese. Sometimes the cuisine, like we all know here as well, sometimes high-level cuisine has this feeling of it's not approachable and it's not every day. And what he wants to do is make his cuisine fun and approachable and feel like it's something really for everyone and casual. So he does all these different plays and has a lot of fun. And if you follow his cuisine or follow his Instagram feed, you kind of see it's not a very stoic place. They have a lot of fun. So we'll see if Hasegawa-san is ready. どうぞ。お願いします。
オープン。
こんにちは。僕は今日初めてここに来てですね、後ろから人がいっぱいいるのを見ながらドキドキしてました。
When I first came into the room, I was standing in the back and seeing so many people in this room. I was very nervous.
今日は皆さんに会えたことを僕は本当に感謝してます。よろしくお願いします。
I'm grateful to be able to be here with all of you. Thank you.
今中東さんの方に日本料理のテクニックをたくさん多分皆さん聞いたと思うんですけども、僕もとても勉強になったので、僕は彼より年が若いのでテクニックは彼よりないので、テクニックのことは今日は話をしないようにしようと思ってます。
Mr. Nakahigashi talked a lot about the Japanese cuisine and its techniques, so I'm sure you learned a lot about that. It was actually very useful for me as well. I'm much younger than Mr. Nakahigashi, so I'm not going to talk about technique.
僕は少し自分がとても大切にしているものをお伝えできればなと思ってます。
What I would like to tell you is what I think is really important and what I try to focus on.
少しだけお店の紹介をします。僕のお店は東京の、神保町というところにあります。料理は日本料理です。
Let me introduce my restaurant to you. My restaurant is located in Jimbocho in Tokyo. It's a Japanese restaurant.
で、僕は若くしてお店を始めたんですけれども、みんな初め若くしてお店をやることをみんなダメだと言いました。
And I started my restaurant when I was rather young. Everybody said that you can't start a restaurant when you're young.
でも若くして始めることはとてもいいことがあって、それは僕を支えてくれる方がたくさんいて、お客様がいろいろ教えてくれるということです。
But there are actually good things about starting a restaurant young. That is that there are many people who will support me, and also that the customers teach me a lot as well.
初めはどんなお料理を作ろうか、どういったテクニックを使ってお客様に食べてもらおうかということだけを考えてました。
Initially, I only thought about what should I cook and what should I give, what kind of technique should I use in order to provide food for my customers.
お客様は全然喜んでくれませんでした。
But the customers were not happy at all.
とても寂しかったです。
It was a shock.
でもそれで分かったことがあるんです。
But I realized something.
僕はお客様のことを何も考えてなかったです。
I wasn't thinking about the customers at all.
自分が作りたいものを、自分が得てきたテクニックを駆使してお客様をびっくりさせようとか驚かせようとかっていう気持ちの方が多かったです。
I was only wanting to make things that I wanted to make. I wanted to use the techniques that I had learned. I wanted to shock and impress the customers, and that was the only thing I was thinking about.
でもそのおかげで分かったことがありました。
But thanks to that, I learned something.
一番大切なのは楽しんでもらうことだと思いました。
And that is that the most important thing is to have them have fun.
なので僕のレストランは一番大切に思うことはお客様が楽しんでご飯を食べてもらうことです。
So what is the most important thing in our restaurant is that the customers enjoy and have fun while they eat there.
日本料理はとても難しいイメージがあってマナーがあったりしきたりがあったりとても難しく感じるんですけれども、それをなくそうと思いました。
Japanese cuisine tends to give the impression of being very difficult. There are strict manners, there are traditions, and it could be unapproachable. But I wanted to get rid of that.
楽しんでもらうためにはどうすればいいのかなといろいろ考えたんですけども、一番大切なのは相手のことを思って作ることだということも分かりました。
I was trying to think about what I can do in order to have the customers enjoy my food. And I think what I realized in the end was the most important thing was for me to think about the customer.
僕は母親のお料理がとても好きです。
I like my mother's cooking very much.
それは多分なんでかなって考えたときに僕のことを思ってくれてるんだと思いました。
When I think about the reason for that, it's because my mother thought about me when she was cooking.
僕の誕生日には僕の好きなものを作ってくれます。
She would make my favorite dishes for my birthday.
そこが何か美味しいものを作るということになるんじゃないのかなとか、喜んでもらう、楽しんでもらえるということにつながるんじゃないのかなと思いました。
And I thought maybe that was the key for making something that was tasty, that was good, that would give pleasure to the people who are eating it and have them have fun.
多分皆さんも子供がいらっしゃる方は子供の誕生日には好きなものを作ったりとか、好きなものをとか子供のことを考えて、もしくは自分の奥様のことや旦那さんのことを考えて、お父さんのこと、お母さんのことを考えて料理を作ったり、いろいろなことをすると思います。
I'm sure all of you will think about your child, your husband, your wife, your father, your mother as you make something special for their birthdays.
ちっちゃい子供にとてもスパイシーなカレーは出さないと思うんです。
You will not give a very spicy curry dish to a small child.
でその相手を思っていろいろ料理を作ることっていうことは皆さん作るんですけれども、でもそういったものだけではなくて、例えばちょっとした楽しさがあるといいかなと思います。
And of course, it's good to try to prepare something that people will enjoy, but I think there should be some playfulness as well.
これはどうですか、見えるのかな、カメラ、あ、これはモナカというものです。カメラって、あ、カメラ。
This is a
すいません。これはこれうちのレストランです。
Oh, I'm sorry. This is my restaurant.
すみません、緊張してて僕これを今やるのを忘れてました。
I was so nervous I forgot to advance the slides.
これは日本料理でいう日本の昔のお菓子でモナカと言います。
This is a traditional Japanese sweet called monaka.
中には普通は小豆が入ってます。
Usually it has red bean paste, azuki inside.
でデザートなのでだいたい一番最後に出るものなんです。
Since it's a dessert, usually it appears at the very end of a meal.
これを一番初めに出したらどうかなと思って、うちのレストランではこれを一番初めに出すことにしてます。
So I thought, what would it be like if I gave that out at the beginning of a meal? So this is what I serve at the very beginning of the meal.
もちろん中身は変えてあります。
Of course, the inside is different.
例えばレストランに行って日本料理でこういったものを開けるという動作もなかなかないですね。
And I think you probably don't experience going to a Japanese restaurant and having to open a package before you eat what's inside.
僕のレストランで箸を使えない人でも大丈夫です。手で食べればいいんで。
But even if you can't use hashi or chopsticks, you can eat this.
で中はですね、日本料理ではあまり使わないんですけども、フォアグラを使ってます。
Although foie gras doesn't really appear on the Japanese menu very often, that is what is inside the monaka.
フォアグラを先ほどと同じなんですけど、味噌漬けにすることによって旨味が出ます。
Foie gras is marinated in miso, like in the earlier dish, and that brings out the umami.
それと日本の昔からある、干し柿というものなんですけれども、それとあとはお漬物、日本の、発酵のものですね、いぶりがっこというスモークしたお漬物と一緒に召し上がってもらうというものを初めにお出ししてます。
And that is combined together with dried persimmon, which probably isn't seen very often here either, and iburigakko pickles, which is a smoked fermented pickle. And that is what I serve at the very beginning of the meal.
でいろんなものを作りすぎて途中で日本料理なのか何なのか分からなくなってしまったことがありました。
Actually, there was a time that I tried doing so many different things that it made it, I didn't know whether I was making Japanese food or what.
でもですね、自分の姉が、農家なのでとても美味しい野菜を作るのでどうしてもサラダを出したいと思いました。
But my older sister is at a farm, or she lives in a farm, and she grows vegetables. So I wanted to find a way to try to serve vegetables.
日本料理ではサラダというものがあまりというかほとんど出ません。
Or rather salad. And in Japanese cuisine, normally salad is not a dish that is served.
他のフレンチとかイタリアンだと、たくさん出るとは思うんですけれども、どうすれば日本料理っぽくなるかなとかっていうことをずっと考えてました。
Of course, French cuisine and Italian cuisine probably serves a lot of salad. So I thought, what can I do in order to make the salad more Japanese-like?
テクニックの話はしないと言ったんですけども、どうしてもサラダだけはちょっと見てほしかったので作り方を少し説明したいと思います。
And I did say that I wasn't going to bring up any cooking techniques to you, but I want you to see the salad, and I wanted to show that to you. So let me tell you how I make the salad.
そうですね、サラダとかお野菜とかお野菜もお魚も例えばこういう器にしてもそうなんですけども全部僕の友達が作ってます。
Everything that I use, the salad, the fish, and even the dishes that I use to serve in are made by my friends.
作ってる人の顔を見ながらお料理を作るとやはりその人の気持ちを、食べてもらう人に伝えることがとても伝えやすくなると思います。
Looking at the person who's going to eat your food and preparing it, I think makes it easier to try to get my feelings across to that person.
ちょっとだけ作り方を説明します。
So let me explain briefly how to make
サラダは
this.
これはもうどこにある自分の好きなサラダ葉物で構いません。
The greens can be any greens that you have, anything that you like.
これにですね、ごま油です。ごま油をこう回しかけます。
And to this, I add sesame oil.
そしてこれを混ぜ合わせますね。
And I mix this together.
で結構ドレッシングをこう作ってかけたりするんですけれども、それだと少しこう葉っぱがですねすぐしんなりになってきてしまったり、ちょっとこう味が濃くなってしまうのが嫌なので違う味の付け方をしてます。
Of course, I could just put a dressing on it, but that tends to wilt the vegetables or the leafy vegetables, and also the flavor tends to be too strong. So I've been trying to come up with a dressing that is not like that. I've been trying to think about what I can do in order to make it less so.
これにですね、塩昆布なんですけれども、日本でいうその昆布、旨味のたっぷりのこの海藻をこちらの方にこのサラダの方にかけていきます。
I take salted kombu, which is made from kombu kelp, which has a lot of umami in it, and I will sprinkle that on top.
これを入れることによって旨味が出ますね。
This gives a lot of umami to the salad.
であとこちらに他のお野菜があるんですけど、例えばきゅうりであったりトマトであったり大根、あとはごぼう、人参があります。これはもう季節のもので全然構いません。
I also have other vegetables here: cucumbers, tomato, daikon radish, gobo, carrots. You can use any seasonal vegetable.
でですね、このお野菜自身にもう味をつけておいてあげれば、味が濃くならなくて済むのかなと思うのと、あと一つ一つに味をつけていくっていうのは日本でお魚とかを調理するときにお寿司なんかはそうなんですけれども、その食材によって味付けを変えてあります。それをお野菜で、作ってあります。
These vegetables actually are seasoned ahead of time, and by seasoning it ahead of time, I thought that might prevent from becoming too strong or too salty. This is also what is done with Japanese fish as well. Usually the seasoning for the fish depends on what that fish is. So what is normally done with fish, I am also doing with the vegetables.
例えばトマト、今の時期あまり甘くないので甘さを補うために砂糖を入れるのではなくて、バニラビーンズを入れて香りをつけます。バニラビーンズ、トマトです。トマト甘酢につけるんですけど、この甘酢にバニラビーンズを入れます。すみません。
For example, the tomato. This time of the year, the tomato is not that sweet. But rather than just putting sugar into it, I add vanilla beans into it.
そうすることによって香りが甘くなるので甘く感じます。
And that gives it a sweeter scent.
で例えばこの次のごぼうはですね、お醤油とお出汁で炊き上げることによって柔らかくなります。
Then the gobo is steamed with soy sauce and dashi to make it softer.
できゅうりなんですけれども、きゅうりは日本でいうお漬物、昆布とあとはお塩、麹で漬け込んでます。
Then cucumber is also pickled with kombu and koji and salt.
次に大根はこれはカツオのお出汁とお醤油で炊き上げてます。これは日本でいう煮物と同じですね。
The daikon radish is boiled with katsuo and soy sauce dashi.
で、人参は、皮のまま皮も美味しいので皮のまま甘酢につけてマリネしてあります。
The carrots actually have really good skin, so I don't peel the carrots. I leave this peel on and I pickle it in sweet vinegar.
この今盛り付けるんですけども、これを見てもらうとあまり和食っぽくは見えないと思います。
So I have plated this, but as you see, it doesn't look really like Japanese food.
でもこれが召し上がってもらうと日本料理になります。
But if you eat this, this will turn into Japanese food.
それは何でだと思いますか？
And why do you think that is?
僕はいろいろ考えて思ったことがあるんですけれども、
There's something I have been thinking about a lot.
日本料理というものは例えばわさびを使ったりお出汁を使うことで日本料理になると思いますか？
Do you think using wasabi and dashi in a dish will make it Japanese food?
多分僕は違うと思うんです。
I don't think it does, actually.
いろいろ旅行して海外のレストランでわさびを使ったり柚子を使ったりお出汁を使ったりするんですけども、やはり僕たちが普段食べ慣れている日本料理とは全く違うものに感じます。
When I go abroad, I might go to a restaurant that uses yuzu and dashi and wasabi, but it doesn't really feel like Japanese food that I'm used to.
なかなか考えて難しかったんですけれども、何かなと思ったらやっぱりその日本料理の食材を使うということではなくて、日本に例えば少しいることによって多分日本の四季を学んだり日本の人との付き合いを学んだり日本人の心を学んだりということが何か関係するのではないのかなととても思いました。
It's rather complicated, but when I thought about it, I thought that making Japanese food doesn't mean using Japanese ingredients. I think going to Japan, spending a little bit of time there, and learning about the Japanese mannerism or learning about the Japanese season, learning about how you interact with people in Japan, understanding the Japanese heart, I think that might have something to do with it.
今回はこれはすべて、こちらにあるもので作っています。
This dish that I prepared today was made by ingredients found locally here.
さっきここの生徒たちみんなで食べたんですけども、やっぱり日本料理の味がするって言ってくれました。
And we actually tried this earlier, and everybody said that it does taste like Japanese food.
僕は昨日から仕込みをさせてもらって、ここの子たちがどういうことを考えているのかな、どういうものを食べたいのかな、何を知りたいのかなと思いながらその時にお料理を作りました。
When I was cooking yesterday, I thought about what do these people want to eat? What are they thinking about? What are they going to enjoy? And as I was thinking about this, I was preparing the dish.
そうするとやっぱりみんなが笑顔で食べてくれますし、なんか楽しんでくれてるっていうことをとても感じました。
And the fact that I was thinking about them as I was preparing the dish, I think led to them enjoying the dish, and I can see that they were enjoying it, and that made me very happy.
分かったことは日本じゃなくても日本料理が作れるのかなと僕は思いました。
what I learned is you don't have to be in Japan to make Japanese food.
なので、皆さんがこう日本料理っていうものに対してこういろんなイメージがあると思うんですけれども、そこにあるそこの食材で相手のことを思って作ることによって、より美味しいものができますし、日本にそうですね、少し来てもらって四季を感じてもらったり、日本の料理を勉強するというよりは日本人の持ってるなんていうんですかね、こう気持ちとかそういったものを少し考えることによってより日本料理に近づく、日本料理に近づくんじゃないのかなと思います。
I'm sure you all have different images and ideas about what Japanese cuisine is, but I think you can make Japanese cuisine by using the ingredients that you find locally where you are, but by thinking about what the other person that you're going to be serving the dish to would like and enjoy. So you think about the other person too, and that'll make the food taste better as well. And also, I would love to have you come to Japan, spend a little bit of time there, feel the seasons in Japan, and rather than going to Japan in order to study Japanese cuisine, try to understand the feelings, the spirit of the Japanese people, and I think that'll bring you one step closer to Japanese cuisine.
なので、終わりました。ありがとうございます。もう大丈夫ですか？今言おうとしたんですけど、一言。
I was going to say one more thing.
なので、料理を作る人も食べる人もみんな楽しんでもらえればいいなと思います。
So I think that people who are going to be cooking the food as well as people who are going to be eating the food should have fun and enjoy it.
ちなみにもう本当に今緊張して喉がカラカラです。
By the way, I am still so nervous. My throat is really dry.
みんなには僕は今とても大きく見えるかもしれませんが、僕の気持ちは今これぐらいです。
You might think that I'm really big, but this is how I feel right now. That's the size.
ありがとう。
Thank you.
It's great. I love the sort of kind of what defines Japanese cuisine. Is it ingredients? Is it techniques? Is it being in Japan? But this kind of feeling, chef's feeling that Japanese cuisine is about Japanese sort of hospitality, this idea of omotenashi hospitality, this forward-facing hospitality, I think is a really great way to look at, as global cuisines meld with each other, what really defines Japanese cuisine. And I think his take on it is really kind of a really beautiful and very sort of refreshing a view of that. If you are in Tokyo and you have a chance to eat at his restaurant, it is a much different experience than any other restaurant in Japan. It's as you can see from his spirit and what he kind of creates in his restaurant is something very unique and serious about his food, but also at the same time, very engaging and playful. Our chef de cuisine at the restaurant just spent a few days cooking in his kitchen 2 weeks ago when we were in Japan, and just had such a great time and a really unique time, and it's something very different that he's doing. And if you follow Chef Hasegawa on Instagram, every day I promise he will make you smile with all of his photos of the little version of himself all over the world. So anyway, our final chef really in the Napa Valley doesn't really require a introduction, but I will give him a small one anyways. Our final chef is Christopher Kostow from the Meadowood, just up the road here, just not even a few miles from here. Chef Kostow received 3 Michelin stars for Meadowood a few years ago, a very much and well-deserved 3 Michelin stars, and has been nominated as Best New Chef both for James Beard and Food and Wine. When I think of Chef Kostow's cuisine, really this sort of blend of innovation and sort of elegance, and really kind of, for me, very much defines the Northern California and his sort of passionate approach to this kind of Northern California and Napa Valley cuisine is always so amazing to see. So very fortunate to have Chef Christopher Kostow.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to translate for you? Or? I was going to say this could
to take half as long because you're only going to hear it one time. Thank you very, very much for coming. I'm super honored to be included amongst these incredibly talented people. There's the thing about Japanese chefs is it's a very humbling experience when you understand the depth of their expertise, the depth of the traditions that go into what they do, sort of the cumulative knowledge that it takes to kind of do what they do. It's something that's almost, I want to say, contrary to the American methodology, but it's certainly different. How many people here have never been to Japan? It's a lot of people, myself included. So why am I here, one may ask. Even though we've never been there, and I say we, I think we all have these impressions of what Japanese cooking is, or what Japanese culture is, or how those two things relate. Maybe I have a little more than most because of additional studying I've done as a chef or increased awareness of products. But really, what I know about Japan and what you probably know about Japan comes from very secondary sources. I know from some books I've read and some chefs I've met, and obviously a lot of the food I've had. So the question is, and it's something that I ask myself often as it relates to Japanese cuisine or other cuisines that are inflected in what we do, what is the role? How authentic is it? How do you make sure there are no jagged edges and everything sort of works as one thing? Because our goal and our intent is to create something that's singular. But that doesn't mean that you're not taking influences from elsewhere. So for me, what's important, and the way I've sort of reconciled this, is what's important is not how authentic my interpretations of things are, but rather how authentic and how honest I am with my own experiences vis-a-vis those things. I've had my experiences with Japanese food, culture, literature, so on and so forth. So what's important is that I'm honest with myself. And what's even more important, probably the most important thing, is that no one ever sees something that we do in the restaurant and says, wow, that's super Japanese. Because that's not our intention. Yes, it's a little bit, it can always be a little bit referential as sort of what we're going to show here, but it's not about mimicry. It's not about trying to necessarily emulate, but it's also not cooking and living with your eyes closed. It's about understanding the experiences you've had and making sure that naturally, in an unforced way, they find their way into your cooking. So I'm going to do a really big dish, but I'm going to do it really quickly because there's a lot of parts and some of these things take months to cook. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more perhaps than cooking. And we're going to show in this dish things that are really Japanese or inspired by things Japanese, but in the end I think the sum of the parts I think are very Napa Valley. I really do. So we're going to start with sakura, which is a traditional, and correct me if any of these words are mispronounced. Kyle knows much more about this than me. Traditionally salted cherry blossoms and cherry leaves. So it's a technique that we've employed to a decidedly un-Japanese ingredient, which is like a fresh goat's cheese. We tend to use a cheese from Petaluma, So Young Scanlon, who's got a beautiful dairy on Dante Dairy out in Petaluma. So what we've done is taken the apple leaves from last year, which are right here, and salted them in a brine. Let me show you the jar. So these are last year's apple leaves. These are from Sierra Beauty apple trees that we have. Taken the leaves, we've salted them in a brine, and what you end up with are these beautiful, salty but super fragrant, very apple-forward leaves. So what we wanted to do is use those as a medium to impart some flavor to what is obviously otherwise a fairly astringent product like a goat's cheese. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap the goat's cheese. We're going to make like a little star, into the middle of which we're going to put the goat cheese itself. I'm going to use my tweezers, and we're going to just very gently wrap it. It doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to end up enveloping it in plastic. So we have this loose parcel here, if you can see that. We're just going to pull it up. And just twist it. So we're going to let it sit as such just to gain its shape, so pretty much overnight. and it kind of adheres to the goat cheese. But then we want to unwrap it, because what the apple leaves are doing, in addition to imparting an apple flavor, it's also drying it out a little bit. We start with a very fresh goat cheese, dries it out a little, gives it a little more complexity in terms of flavor and texture. So that's going to sit to the side. We're going to move on to the next thing, which is maybe more of a Korean technique than Japanese technique, although I've read that it's used in Japanese cooking as well. These are black apples. So employing the technique utilized for black garlic. These are Sierra Beauty apples, same as the leaves, and they're cooked for 40 days at more or less dehydrator temperature. And what you get are these very, very sweet, we said knife, very, very sweet, very umami, the knife, yeah, very, very sweet, very umami textures.
Is that actually in the dehydrator, or where are they? So they're in the dehydrator for that one.
Yeah. And then after, so what you get is this super beautiful pasty. I wish you could see this. There you go. You got it? Very, very pasty, sweet texture. We'll then pull it out of the dehydrator and let it for a few days so they're not overly dry, and we end up with this great texture. So that's going to be part of the dish as well. Which begs the question, is that Japanese? I don't know. You know, when I get asked that question, when I have guests from France in at the restaurant, they always think the food's super French. When I have Korean guests in, they think the food's very Korean. When I have Japanese guests, they think it's very Japanese. I guess it's a compliment, I would hope. But, you know, it begs the question, is this Japanese food? Is this Japanese cooking? And to the earlier chef's point, I think that's just an incredibly interesting question, and one that he raised very well, that it's more about the sentiment involved necessarily than the use of wasabi and soy. I would say that this is our style of cooking. It's Napa style of cooking. It's the restaurant in Meadowood style. In the end, it's something that works within the milieu of what we're doing. There's no jagged edges. It all sort of makes sense. So the next part of this dish, and what any chef can attest to is the hardest thing to do well, and I don't know that we're there yet, is bread baking. So we wanted to do a bread that, I don't even want to say complemented the acidity of the goat cheese, but actually highlighted it. We wanted a super, super tart bread that mimicked a real slow ferment, but maybe had a little more umami. So what we do is we actually make a koji rice, which is a brown rice that we've pressure cooked, inoculated with aspergillus, and allowed to ferment. We then cook it again, and you end up with this porridge, which is incredibly complex in flavor, acidic, has a beautiful sort of fermented flavor, almost like something of the sea. And while we'll fold this dough, which is just a levain dough, we'll fold it several times, and on one of the last folds, we'll actually fold in the koji porridge. This is really messy, but you get the idea. So we're going to fold that in. This is going to get several more folds before it's baked. And the koji obviously gives it that sort of acidity and flavor. We've talked about it, but it also gives it a toothiness and a moistness that you really can't get doing it any other way. So we don't have a deck oven at the restaurant, so we actually bake the bread in staubs or large Le Creuset that have been heated to kind of mimic the floor of a deck oven. And you end up with this, where you get a beautiful, beautiful crust on it. And it's something we're kind of proud of, because we more or less taught ourselves. So there's koji. So far we've seen sakura, we've seen black apples, we've seen koji. So the dish as a whole, the presentation of which is maybe the most Japanese thing of all. And maybe sort of that point of intersection between Napa Valley and Japan, or that sort of ephemeral place. And that we sort of bring it out as this beautiful set. We bring it out onto the table, we change whatever the table setting is at that time. We put on the table the blossoms from the Sierra Beauty apples. We put on the table, in sort of a distressed linen, a slice of the koji bread. And then we bring onto the table the plate itself, your tweezers. So what we'll do is, I don't know if you can see this. So that's the set you see there before you. So onto the plate, we'll just do these beautiful little succulents. We'll do little chard leaves and purslane, orac. Some pieces of that black apple. And what's really nice about the cooking of the black apples is they generate this beautiful little, called a saba, which is this extracted, fermented, caramelized apple syrup. And then a little bit of St. Helena olive oil. So all this will go out to the table. And then someone in a suit who can do this better than I will go out with the wrapped cheese, unwrap it in front of the guest. And they'll get their plate. So again, they'll get their beautiful little blossoms, their beautiful bread, and their plate of cheese. And then the question is asked, is that Japanese cooking? And I don't know. And I tend to leave it to the guest to make those decisions, just as I think any chef is wary of committing to some sort of idea of identity or description of the food they do or the work they do, because once you're defined as something, it's pretty hard to be something else. So I'm actually going to Japan for the first time in 2 weeks. So maybe I'll come back and be like, that's terrible. But I think, again, that idea, the most important thing and the biggest takeaway for me is just to embrace and be honest with the experience we've had. I think as an American chef, we write about this a lot in the book, that everyone's always looking at what's happening in Scandinavia at one moment, or Peru, or Mexico City, or for a while France or Spain. When in the end, as Americans and as American chefs, we have a wide variety of culinary experiences. We all grew up, perhaps greater than any other citizenry, eating different foods of different ethnicities. And while we may lack in depth what we have in volume, those experiences and those food memories, I think, are just as applicable, perhaps, and more applicable to us than a chef who has a mastery owing to 500 years. It's about embracing what we know, who we are, and maybe not